Welcome back to Seeking the Truth about the Sword of Truth. My name is Tom, and I will be your guide as we spend this episode exploring Chapter 11 of Wizard's First Rule. In our last episode, Zed helps Richard on his long journey to become the master of his emotions rather than their servant. He makes Kaelin destroy a perfectly innocent tree and induces a bout of mass hysterical castration on a group of 50 men. Please note that these episodes contain spoilers, heavy spoilers, not just for this chapter, but for future chapters and books in the series. If you haven't read the series yet and you intend to, I'd encourage you to read the books first and then come back to me and see what I think about them. Spoiler alert, the more I look at these characters, the more I'm able to see myself. At the beginning of this chapter, best estimates place the time since the beginning of Wizard's First Rule on the evening of the 4th day. We begin this chapter on a trail leading away from Zed's home, which was just destroyed by Dark and Rahl. Richard, Kaelin, and Zed are under attack from a pair of short-tailed Gars. In this moment, I will be discussing an official retraction of previous information contained in Chapter 7 of Wizard's First Rule. I described Zed's interaction with the Gar as a symbol for a stronger cognitive force overpowering a weaker one. While the end result remains unchanged, I do feel that I previously missed the mark when it comes to finding the most fitting description of the symbolism behind Zed's interaction with the first Gar. Rather than a representation of the collision of two cognitive forces, where the stronger one obliterates the weaker one, this interaction much more closely resembles the symbolism of a deflection of force, where it's turned back on itself without damaging the person who was the original intended target. The genesis of this revelation is my analysis of the fight that Richard, Kaelin, and Zed have with the two short-tailed Gars at the beginning of Chapter 11. The key difference symbolically is the interaction between the two forces. In the first example with Richard and Kaelin in Chapter 4, the best symbolic representation was of an imminent cognitive collision, and additional interaction without the power to change the outcome would obey the conservation of cognitive dissonance and intensify the effect, rebounding it back on the person using it. Zed's interaction in Chapter 7 is a symbolic avoidance of the cognitive collision, where the entirety of the intended force is redirected back on the one who initiated. Which brings me to Chapter 11. This fight with these Gars is a representation of what happens when two cognitive forces decide to fight it out, and one of them attempts to overpower the other by force. The first sentence of the chapter tells us, Richard is saved from total destruction by the cat in his backpack. Having already established the heightened senses of cats in a previous chapter, it is perfectly reasonable that the cat on Richard's back would have access to information he does not. Zed's cat is Richard's intuition, and it is fitting the cat would enjoy a residence within his backpack. The access to intuition from the subconscious is a tool at his disposal, and having that tool in his backpack since childhood makes perfect sense symbolically. The cat gives Richard a warning, which he acts on without any other information to go off of, and in this instance it saves him. Not enough to avoid being damaged, but enough to avoid being destroyed. Richard is struck from behind, knocked over, and clawed in the back. The Gar pounces on him and knocks the wind out of him, pinning him to the ground, keeping him from drawing the sword of truth to defend himself. If the symbolism here is a representation of how cognitive forces interact with each other, then the meaning behind this is the opposing force is making its own claim from a position of certainty, and nothing is capable of changing that, not even the truth. All Richard can do is cover up and try to protect himself. He also sees Zed knocked off balance, tumbling into the woods with the other Gar in pursuit. Both of these are symbols of cognitive violence. Arguments are made passionately and forcefully. When they impact, there is only the conservation of cognitive dissonance. The impact causes damage, expressed as the natural instinctive response to fight back head on. Kaelin throws a bunch of rocks at the Gar on top of Richard. The Gar takes no damage but is angered by this. Richard feels crushed by the weight of the beast and tries to use force to fight his way free, but he cannot because his strength is not sufficient to complete the task in that way. Richard pulls fur from the Gar and is bitten by blood flies. This exchange is a symbolic of the butting of heads that occurs when two individuals are attempting to express an idea but are not feeling validated. Each pushes by force of will to express their idea in a way that ignores the consent of the interaction of the other person, resulting in a stalemate. Richard is able to get free when Kaelin breaks the stalemate by throwing rocks at the Gar. Even though the rocks don't have the power to hurt the Gar, she's able to make the Gar angry enough to give up its advantage and attack her instead. Kalen's rocks are like the Gar's blood flies, or Zed's bait and switch between the words witch and warlock. They are strategic weaponizations of cognitive dissonance designed to provoke an angry but predictable response. Once the Gar responds to the harmless rocks, it uses a portion of that strength to attack Kalen, snatching her up and holding her by the hair. The cat leaps into action, biting and scratching the eyes and face of the Gar. A write-up for purrcraze.com titled "Are Maine Coon Cats Protective?" says that while normally the Maine Coon cat is considered to be a gentle creature, they have shown their protective instincts by scratching and biting aggressors and jumping on children who look like they're about to play with something dangerous to stop them. Some cats also try to rescue their owners from drowning in the bathtub or the shower. As a cat owner, I can attest to this. I have several cats who will meow at me frequently whenever I am covered in water. Given the cat's relationship to Richard and its recent time on Kalen's lap, and its more feral tendencies being fed from its steady diet of live mice, it's well within the realm of reason to have the cat behave in this way without any sort of magical intervention from Zed and his potential Dr. Dolittle shenanigans. Also, as a representation of intuition, the cat's intervention symbolizes the identification of weakness in the attack created by the strategic weaponized cognitive dissonance as the best chance for a counterattack. So when it is angry, that is the best time to use the truth. Richard manages to escape from the Gar and rolls to his feet, drawing the Sword of Truth. With a mighty swing, he brings the weapon down and severs the arm holding Kalen just before he is once again sent flying back from a mighty counterstrike. The symbology is very straightforward. Richard uses the beast's distraction to allow himself the opportunity to use the truth to cut directly into the beast. Richard does damage, but the damage isn't sufficient to destroy the threat, so he is met with an equal and opposite force that damages him as much as he damages his opponent. Reeling from the force of the blow, Richard realizes he has just lost his bearing as well as his grip on the Sword of Truth. While he is attempting to get oriented, Richard is blindsided by the force of Zed's release of magic, which is strong enough to knock the Gar from its feet by concussive force alone and fling him into a nearby tree. To further grow the comparison, Richard's loss of the sword is representative of the instinctive response to cognitive dissonance. The force of the collision causes one to lose their grip on the truth and beckons them instead to allow their actions to be dictated by instinct rather than by reason. It's another representation of the damage created by the conservation during the direct interaction. The dissonance creates an impulse, and the impulse attempts to override everything, even things which can be seen which are in direct contradiction to observable reality. Richard searches for the sword, and while he can't see it, once his anger ignites, he's able to sense its location and scrambles to reach it. But before he can gain his grasp on the weapon, the Gar kicks him in the side so hard he loses all sense of direction, breaking his ribs in the process. This search, absent stimuli from the senses, represents the trust in ration and reason to give direction when the senses cannot. While the senses often work in combination with logic and reason, it is the moment when the senses fail to provide an answer that logic and reason are the only hope for a successful outcome. Richard fights through the pain and dives for the sword, but he is caught at the last moment and held by his ankle, upside down as the Gar wraps its rings around him, drawing him close. Richard's only recourse is kicking the bloody stump of the Gar so it drops him. The symbolism here is, via a direct confrontation, via the conservation of cognitive dissonance, the truth is capable of wounding. And absent an alternative, when force must be used, attacking the damage done by the truth is the most effective application of force. It's much the same way a sharp blade will do more damage than an iron bar, given equal mass and velocity behind the attack. So too does a direct application of simple truth by force penetrate deeper than a forceful attack fueled by strong emotion, but ultimately unfounded in reality. While Richard momentarily is free, Zed unleashes the power of Wizard's Fire and incinerates the Gar completely, leaving nothing behind. Wizard's Fire comes up repeatedly throughout the Sword of Truth series as a powerful weapon, capable of burning through any living thing. Within the symbolism of the conservation of cognitive dissonance, this is representative of the most efficient weaponization of the truth, which delivers maximum destruction while minimizing the impact to the wielder. But it does not escape the laws of the conservation of cognitive dissonance, because even in this example, the Wizard's Fire is conjured from the wizard. Many times throughout the Sword of Truth series, we learn that wizards must constantly confront the limitations of their own stamina, their own power, and their own sustainability. They can't do this forever, and eventually they would be overrun. The fight is over, and Richard is wounded. He says the Gar kicked him in his left side, and now it hurts to breathe. In a collection of slides produced by simplyhealth.io titled 14 Symptoms of a Broken Rib, several of Richard's symptoms are mentioned. This type of injury is dangerous because the ribs can move, displace, or poke into things that they aren't supposed to, like the lungs or other internal organs. Richard tells Zed he's having trouble breathing, and Zed pulls the same, looking at Richard's injury and acting like it isn't life-threatening thing that it is, that he uses in Chapter 6 to tell Richard, oh, it can't be that bad since there are no bones sticking out. The presentation from simplyhealth.io goes on to say, sometimes difficulty breathing might be a signal that the rib fracture is far worse than initially thought, and you are automatically put in more danger because the fact that fractures can poke through on the inside but remain unseen from the outside. They say, and rightly so, if you experience pain while breathing, get to the emergency room immediately. You may have a punctured lung. Richard turns to Zed and says, don't even act like that giant fireball wasn't actual magic. And Zed says, he's not going to act like that giant fireball wasn't actual magic. Zed also says that if Darkenrahl was watching, he would have been able to see it too. Physically, this statement makes sense given how visible fire is across vast distances. In 2010, scienceblogs.com released an article written by user Rallian titled, How Fast is the Beacon of Gondor? Calculating an estimated distance of 50 miles spanning across the multiple beacons of Gondor. With an average distance of greater than 10 miles between each beacon, showing signal fires are effective at creating visible points which are visible from great distances. Now, if an example pulled from a fictional universe is not sufficient evidence to prove the credibility of a statement made in a second fictional universe, I suggest that all believers in such a position leave their homes immediately and conduct a similar experiment under controlled conditions where they can trust their own senses to give a better result. And if you could, please post the results of that experiment in the comments below. While Zed is trying to stabilize Richard's condition, Kaelin touches Richard's hand and he experiences a powerful warning that surges through the Sword of Truth. Richard recognizes the magic is trying to warn him of serious danger. While this will be covered in greater detail in future videos, in simple terms, Richard's gift, warning him about Kaelin touching him, is a warning about the power of love. Symbolically, the threat of Kaelin's confessor's power is the threat of what happens when feelings of love are permitted to become the higher power of the person experiencing them. It is the same mechanism that convinces people it's okay to act terribly by anger. They just act terribly justified by love instead. The decision to allow feelings to direct what decisions will be made and why it is just as dangerous as using anger to execute that same dynamic. In both instances, the path ends in a cognitive singularity, and Zed would say dead is dead. It doesn't matter if it is love or if it is anger, if it leads to a cognitive singularity, which is the death of the rational mind, which is now ruled by feelings. Loving Kaelin could be just as dangerous as hating Darkenrahl. Zed tells Richard that 3 of his ribs are injured, and he's going to put some magic around them to keep them strong until they can finish healing on their own. An article released by the National Center of Biotechnology Information titled Open Fracture Management, written by 2 doctors of the Charleston area medical clinic, says that ribs cannot be braced or splinted in the same way traditional types of fractures and breaks can. This means that it can be harder to keep ribs in place properly for the duration of the healing period, which usually lasts for 6 to 8 weeks after a fracture has been set. Zed gets to cheat a little bit and use his magic to overcome the limitations of modern medicine through a little bit of hocus pocus. Zed talks to Richard in a calm and soothing voice, telling him he's putting magic around them, and the words seem to mean less. And after a time, Richard felt like he was waking from a sleep, feeling much better but not completely healed. This is our first introduction to healing magic, and it has extreme significance as far as symbolism and function are concerned. Healing in the Sword of Truth universe is meant to demonstrate the general cognitive field theory of empathy. In physics, the general theory of relativity is most famously known for its explanation of why gravity works the way that it does. You can't take gravity in your hand and hold it. You can't even see it, but we know it's there because a determined cat will always succeed at its evil schemes to break expensive glassware by pushing it out a countertop with gravity as its willing accomplice. To explain general relativity, the simplest example is to imagine a thin rubber sheet that is stretched out. That flat sheet is our universe in its empty state. There's no gravity there. And if you were to roll a plastic ping pong ball across the sheet, it would travel in a straight line. Now, imagine a steel ball is placed on that sheet, stretching it as the weight of the ball causes the sheet to deform. So if you took that same ping pong ball and rolled it at the same speed in the same direction, it would then naturally roll into that depression, or at least be attracted to it, even though there is no force acting directly on it. Well, that's all well and good, but what does that have to do with empathy, right? If we review the conservation of cognitive dissonance from our previous chapters, remember the most common cause of cognitive dissonance is a fallacy of consent, which is paraphrased in the wizard's 13th rule. We cannot change the nature of humanity by force, violence, or taking away their freedom. The only weapon that can be used and succeed is one wielded with the truth and love. Any other weapon will be unsuccessful or make the dissonance more powerful. That is, people forget that other people have to choose to agree with them on their own. No matter how strong an argument is, that consent needs to be satisfied, or you will be introducing contradictory information into the system. You will create an equal and opposite force and have the opposite of the effect you desired. Cognitively, people can observe the physical interactions when it comes to equal and opposite reactions. It's still possible to experience these forces because we can feel the point of impact. You feel the doubling down, feel the affirmations and validations which make up most of our cognitive cause and effect relationships. Because of the impact, we're able to learn without understanding why that it's a bad idea to yell at someone who's already yelling, because we'll just make it worse. We might not put it together that it is the injection of our own fallacy of consent which causes things to get worse, and we just chalk that up to the other person being a moron. Empathy is a lot trickier because it's possible to be in orbit around something without ever feeling its pull directly. We can look at other people who have somehow gathered large circles of friends and loved ones, and we can tell there's a certain charisma which makes these people interesting, but it's hard to pin down, and you can chase it forever without running into it. Just like the stable orbit of our planet around the sun. And we so ironically, assumed for a long time that the universe revolved around the Earth, and it made perfect sense based on observation. It wasn't until we were able to step outside of that observation and see that we were actually responding to another heavenly body, the sun. And that heavenly body was responding to another heavenly body, the supermassive black hole at the center of our galaxy. And in turn, these galaxies interact with each other and are connected via cosmic webs. And assuming the universe continues to exist long enough beyond ourselves, our galaxy will actually collide with the Andromeda galaxy, changing everything. But none of those things that make orbits happen can be seen with the naked eye. It's only very recently that we've even had the ability to detect and measure ripples in gravity at all. So in the field of cognitive physics, empathy and compassion behave like these large objects do in the universe. And rather than force a collision, producing an equal and opposite reaction, they bend the cognitive interaction and create a pull on everyone and everything around them, slowly drawing things toward them. Now, this theory doesn't negate the conservation of cognitive dissonance. It's still possible that there are many, many energetic reactions going on that produce so much localized force that they wouldn't be caught up in the empathetic attraction, and they will zip right along like it isn't even there. It's also true that by comparison, this force is much more gradual, but is also much further reaching. But usually, it's not as strong as the equal and opposite reaction directly in response to a jolt of cognitive dissonance. Richard listens to Zed as he calmly tells him that he can help with the pain, but he won't be able to remove it completely. Much like there are many different kinds of common interactions of cognitive dissonance, there are also many different interactions between empathy and cognitive dissonance. This specific action of healing is a symbolic of the words and feelings a person would use to try and make someone who is hurting emotionally feel better. It's a soothing interaction. They can identify with the pain and take some of it onto themselves, helping the person have enough strength to get back on their own feet emotionally. And you may have even recognized this by instinct. If you were hurting emotionally one day and you just needed someone to talk to, someone who would listen, someone who would understand, you recognized that you needed empathy to heal and that fighting was only going to make you feel worse. They can put a splint around it and make it feel better enough so a person can heal on their own. And that is how there is magic in forgiveness. It is a similar interaction, which I'll cover later. While the wounds here are represented physically, it's important to remember that symbolically the wounds are a form of the repeated clashes of forceful cognitive dissonance, and that's where they come from. These impacts do damage to the mind and its ability to use reason instead of respond to the pain of dissonance. Too much repeated exposure will eventually destroy a person's ability to do anything except run from that pain. The empathy and the healing is meant to represent the ability to take some of that pain and validate it for a person so they aren't consumed by it. It is the empathy that gives a person something to latch onto that will heal them. There is magic in forgiveness. There is more magic in being forgiven. Healing in the Sword of Truth is representative of someone who understands the dissonance and the pain it causes and forgiving the person for punishing themselves with dissonance, which they could easily have avoided if they hadn't placed their constant fear of letting others be in charge of their emotional state. Once that forgiveness is offered, whether someone knows they need it or not, that is where the real power comes from. There is value to the person who does it, but there is a cost. The deeper the hurt, the deeper the dissonance, the harder the person is going to fight against letting it go because they are scared it will hurt, even if they are fighting the person who's trying to help them, which happens a lot. This is why it takes a deep understanding of that pain and where it comes from for the person trying to help to be able to withstand that force. There is a cost to helping other people heal, and it is a cost the right kind of person will choose to pay when they think it can help someone else, and they are okay with paying that cost. The cost of that isn't good or bad either. It just is. It's up to the person to decide if they will pay it and why. Some people might be beyond help, beyond the reach of anything that could get close enough to actually make a difference without the person who's trying to help being consumed by their own dissonance. The person's perception of the final outcome is what determines if the cost is good or bad. If the attempt works and a greater amount of life is saved because of the intervention, then in a few days, weeks, or months of sacrifice might be a cost worth paying if it means someone else will get to enjoy another 40 or 50 years of cognitive health where the capacity for reason is still intact. If it fails and the original goal is not realized, then the cost did not produce the intended result. But in both cases, no amount of money or prayer will restore the precious and irreplaceable time that was lost. A person could succeed at their goal and feel like the time they spent helping others could have been better spent used to help themselves, or could have been spent cultivating and maintaining relationships with close friends and loved ones. Even though they succeeded at their goal, they feel they exercised poor judgment at choosing their goal in the first place, making it a bad thing for them. Conversely, someone who is savvy with their time may layer multiple goals on top of one another that are all achieved through the same action. If that person fails to achieve their main objective, it's still possible for them to feel the cost was worth paying because they also used the opportunity to practice a new skill or learn a new and useful thing. The fact that time can be spent in ways like that that result in a bad outcome is neither good nor bad. It just is. The individual is the one who has ownership of the decision and how to use their time. And if they feel it was time well spent, either way, the time is spent and there is no control over that. It's gone forever. That is why healing always hurts in the Sword of Truth series. There's always a cost. Sometimes it succeeds and sometimes it fails. But what makes the story compelling is that it doesn't try to hide these facts behind a filter of false virtue. There is no glory in fact. There is only fact. And whenever we go looking to find virtue or vice in something that simply is, That is the exact moment we go looking for trouble in the form of correlation without causation. And in every instance, that exercise causes a person to willingly give up a part of themselves that is capable of using logic and reason to understand something completely, even if they don't like it or its implications. Facts by themselves shouldn't make a person joyful or angry. It's always the person who uses or ignores those facts that is deserving targets of anger and joy. Richard gets up, thanks Zed and the cat, feeling strong enough to worry about the wounds on his back later. While he's getting his pack, there is no mention of any bruising or damage to the large amount of apples that Richard is carrying in his pack. This implies one of three things. The first being that Richard is very skilled in the practice of packaging apples in his backpack to prevent bruising damage. This would be achieved by placing layers of cloth between the individual layers of apples, preventing them from bruising one another. Given Richard's vast experience as someone who knows how to live off the land, this is a plausible explanation. The second explanation is, while the backpack was admittedly thrown in the fight, it may have been done so in a way which wasn't as jarring as the force of impact which Richard received. The third possible, but also least likely explanation, is the apples in the backpack have plot immunity. Plot immunity is a phenomenon in fiction which allows characters or objects to avoid the consequences of events that would remove them from the plot. Those apples, currently numbered at 198, are important to future sections of the story and therefore must be protected. When Zed and Kaylin aren't looking, Richard takes the tooth from around his neck and slips it into his pocket faster than a crooked tax collector's cut of the action on the great communal day of shared sacrifice. Richard still has wounds that he knows must be treated. He also knows he will have to remove his shirt to accomplish that, so he needs to avoid letting them see the tooth and avoid any uncomfortable questions. As established in previous lessons for the series, the tooth is a physical representation for Richard's own fallacy of consent. He has decided his father's secret is more important than anything else in the world, and he hides it from everyone, keeping it to himself. Notice how Richard is always aware of this, but everyone around him is not. This moment is a symbolic representation of the effect that people take and the lengths they will go to hide their own cognitive failings from others by layering reasons and rationalizations over them. The mind fights to hang on to these false conclusions and held beliefs with such ferocity that it is unmatched anywhere else. Richard takes the tooth and hides it. He uses it. He shifts it like a shell game. Whatever happens, it cannot be allowed to be brought to the surface, even when it needs to be addressed to heal wounds that have been created. Many a times, a person will choose to destroy themselves, their relationships, and everyone around them before admitting the feeling they are having is based on itself and wouldn't stand up under logical scrutiny from the mind it is inside. To protect itself, to protect the mind from cognitive pain, the fallacy buries itself deeply and is difficult to suss out. The three continue their journey, and Richard leads them down a small path. Zed uses sparkle dust to cover their tracks, and all of them have a careful eye looking to the sky to make sure they aren't taken off guard again. The author describes Richard as walking with his hand on the hilt of the sword, even though it is uncomfortable. Repeatedly, the raised wire, which spells out the word truth, is described as uncomfortable to hold. While this discomfort is not the same from the same cause, the symbolism remains the same. The truth by its existence creates dissonance when it is placed next to a lie. And while Richard is happy to see the path to his friend's house, that really is a symbolic fallacy of consent in his pocket. And so long as it remains unresolved, it's going to stick out for him more than a high schooler's blue jeans during a random moment of instinct when he's called to the front of the class to explain how a problem is solved. After traveling by moonlight, Richard arrives at Chase's house and is stopped by a heavy wooden oak door with iron strap hinges. For comparison, according to the Home Depot sales website, the industry standard for a commercially produced residential door for a private residence is 6 feet 8 inches tall, 36 inches wide, and 1 3/4 inches thick, weighing anywhere from 40 to 80 pounds for a solid piece, depending on the material, with simple hidden hinges. This door is described as having heavy strap iron hinges. A strap hinge is characterized by a long, slim design consisting of 2 pieces of triangular-shaped metal connected by a rotating axis in the middle. The force of gravity acts on the center mass of the gate or door, but the hinges act on the left edge. The distance between this means that there is a net force on the gate, which is not zero, giving the gate a tendency to rotate. Stopping this rotation must require an equal and opposite torque from the hinges. Now, if we're talking about the lower hinge on the rotation axis, it can't exert any torque. That means everything has to come from the top hinge, and that in turn means there must be a horizontal component of force to that top hinge. That is why heavier doors and gates usually have strap hinges. The elongated shape connects through the material instead of into the side and interacts well with the center of gravity of the door, greatly reducing the torque on the fasteners which attach the door to its frame. In science terms, as long as the length of the hinge as it approaches the door is greater than 0, then there must be a reduce of the total torque on the fasteners of the upper hinge, making it less likely to deform enough to drag the right edge of the door into the ground. Given the homeowner's profession, the description of the door as heavy, the need for iron strap hinges, the level of technology, it is a safe bet to assume that this door was built for function, not form. For the purposes of this exercise, we will assume that the standard height and length of a residential door. However, since this door was built for function, the thickness of 1.75 inches would not be sufficient to withstand an attempted force entry. The average thickness of a medieval wooden gate, specifically constructed to prevent force entry, is 4 inches. But that seems like overkill for this situation. I have chosen a thickness of 3 inches as a reasonable assumption for Chase's door. Given the average material density of oak is 0.77 and accounting for the weight of at least 3 iron strap hinges, this equates to a total weight of approximately 260 pounds for Chase's front door. Assuming Chase didn't blow his entire budget on wood and hinges, so long as he uses the proper type of lock to take full advantage of his door's robust construction, this door would be capable of keeping a modern-day SWAT team at bay for quite some time. The standard issue 30-pound police battering ram can distribute upwards of 3 tons of force on impact. That's 6,000 pounds. This is usually more than enough to get the job done for modern-day locks, which prioritize form over function, because by the nature of their construction, all of the impact is focused down to a single point. About 1,200 to 1,700 pounds of force is required to break open a standard residential 1.75-inch door. With proper form, a battering ram is not required to breach a home, and the heel kick of a trained martial artist or a determined large man can produce upwards of 2,000 pounds of force. However, given the material and construction of Chase's door, it would require upwards of 8,000 or 9,000 pounds of force to breach that door. Even more than that is required if he has the bolts and the strap hinges welded instead of mechanically fastened, and the door is barred from the inside. The following statement is not a paid endorsement for any company. TheFirestorm.com sells a product called the Hydra Ram one-man hydraulic forcible entry tool for $2,400. It is a hydraulic battering ram that is capable of producing 10,000 pounds of force and is so effective at quickly breaching doors that several states have passed legislation restricting its use in law enforcement. While this would be enough to defeat Chase's door without reinforcement, another product, which is also not a paid endorsement from any company, called the Buddy Bar Door Jamb, sells for about $100 and is a simple but effective tool which is rated to add an additional 2,500 pounds of force of resistance to a standard residential door. Assuming that Chase built the best door that he could, matching the author's description, and was willing to go through the added trouble of installing a bar brace on the inside of his home to secure it, the entrance to his home would be capable of resisting nearly 12,000 pounds of force, enough to resist the Hydra hydraulic ram long enough to give everyone inside ample time to mount a tactical response to that threat. While I was researching this video, I knew in my head that most modern doors were not meant to act as a dependable barrier against forced entry. However, now that I've put numbers behind it and have realized how easily a strong kick from a determined individual would give them access to my home, I decided to purchase the Door Buddy for my own private residence. Since this decision was the direct result of the train of thought mentioned here, I will include a link to the product in the description below. However, personal and brand integrity is important to me as a content producer above all else, and I am committed to following that rule for myself in as many different ways as possible. Therefore, by that standard, I must say that as an affiliate of Amazon, that a purchase of this product from that referral link would benefit me financially by $3.27. However, that is not my intention. Leaving a clearly marked path to my own decisions for others to follow, if they choose to, is my intention. If your personal code of conduct is one that does not agree with affiliate programs, your life is yours alone, rise up and live it. This product is widely available through other means, and as a staunch advocate of informed consumer rights, I would applaud any decision made for sound reason which benefits the person who is giving money earned from their own precious and irreplaceable time. So stick it to the man wherever you can. Your money and your time are valuable. While Richard is standing at the door, we learn Zed and Kaylin were left behind because Chase's privacy fence has more spikes than a porcupine making sweet love to a sea urchin. Right as Richard is about to knock on the door, he's grabbed by the hair and has a knife pressed against his throat, causing him to freeze. The instinctive response to freeze is a visceral knowledge of cause and effect. Right or wrong, in that moment, Richard knows if he tries to use force to meet the force that's being used against him, he will not have sufficient strength to overcome the threat without being killed in the process. The act of hair pulling while fighting with a knife is commonly a used technique in the Libre fighting system, a symptom that shares many similarities with the Dance of Death, later discussed in future novels. The principles of the Libre fighting system are described by GuardianFighting.com. States, Libre doesn't limit himself to set techniques. It only studies advantages, including the use of clothing, spitting, biting, pinching, hair pulling, headbutting, and smashing an opponent's head into a skull, curb, or table. One of the core teachings that they have is that the knife is not the weapon, the person holding it is. Richard identifies himself by asking the person with a knife to his throat is Chase. And Chase accuses Richard of trying to get himself killed by sneaking up on a Navy SEAL's private residence in the middle of the night instead of knocking on the gate. Richard insists that it was only his intention not to wake the man's family, which caused him to put himself in needless moral peril. Chase says to Richard, "There's blood all over you. How much of it is yours?" Richard says, "Don't worry about it," and pays Chase back for putting a knife to his throat by making him walk to unlock the gate and let Zed and Kaylin inside. Taking full advantage of the fact that in his haste to protect his home and family, by forcing him to walk on twigs and acorns in his bare feet, as Chase did not have time to put on the same kind of travel boots that Richard was already wearing, when Richard would have been fully capable of opening the gate himself. To continue the trend of linking main characters to the virtues of objectivism, Chase would most closely represent the virtue of independence. Out of all the characters in The Sword of Truth, Chase is most often presented as a master of his world. And while he has the wisdom to choose where he will and will not be effective, he is very good at being effective where he chooses to go, except when there are acorns and twigs on the ground. That's the Clark Kent effect all the way. Chase leads the three of them inside his home, and we're introduced to the supporting character of Emma Bradstone, who is described as a compassionate, considerate, but also practical woman who isn't bothered by much of anything. Emma is described as having gray-streaked hair that is tied back. According to an awfully presented, barely legible, pop-up riddled and congested article at cosmopolitan.com, the things I do for you people. On average, by age 30, most women begin seeing some gray hair, and by age 50, most women can expect to have at least 50% of their total hair turn gray in color. While we're never told for sure, gray streaks is more than a few, but less than 50%, suggesting that Emma Bradstone is somewhere in her late 30s to early 40s. Emma starts making everyone tea, and the author tells us that it isn't unusual for people covered in blood to show up in the middle of the night. While the tea is cooking, Richard takes Cat out of his pack and puts it on Kaylin's lap, reducing the number of total cats in Richard's backpack to 0. We're given another example of Chase's independence as the author tells the story about how he cut down the trees and prepared the lumber to build his house. It also talks about how he carved his children's names into the wooden beams, tagging them. In October 2019, Artifact magazine released an article titled "Psychology of a London Graffiti Artist." And one of the people who, by their own admission, regularly commits the illegal act of putting paint on property that does not belong to them without the consent of the owner, says, "It's all about showing the world I'm here," and that his self-esteem is boosted when he sees his tag around London. By the artist's own words, it feels good, so it is good. The assignment of morality based on feelings is a correlation without causation. We don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's a perfectly good waste of a baby. I had plans for that baby for something that wasn't seeing how far I could throw it with a bunch of water. The act of putting words or images on a thing because it makes a person feel more connected to the world around them is neither good nor evil. It just is. When, where, who, and how, and what surrounds that decision gives us the information we need to make a decision if that act is good or bad. I don't think anyone is going to give Chase the business for doing it, and even if they wanted to, I don't think he would take kindly to a monument to his kids being questioned when there is a large man and a door capable of withstanding 12,000 pounds of force standing between them and the outside world. The author uses another example to bond us to the idea of Chase's independence through the use of one of the fastest story circles in the entire Sword of Truth series. Chase, the protagonist, has a need for a fireplace, and he builds one. To do that, he needs to leave his comfort zone to travel collecting rocks to build it. Every time he left his home to get a rock, he's also accompanied by a different adventure. Chase gets what he wants when he finds the rock and gets back. He paid a price for enduring whatever trouble he had to get before making it home, having changed by gathering another piece of his fireplace, making it into more than the sum of its parts by giving it a useful purpose. Given Chase as the representation of independence, then the method of construction for his fireplace has significance. The stones are the different skills that we learn throughout our lives. Acquiring new ones takes time and effort, but every time we do it, we bring something back with us that we didn't have before. And once we have enough of them, we're able to build something useful. Being able to make these videos is the method, in the method that I do, is accumulation of dozens of different skills that I've gathered over the years. And by doing this the way that I am, I'm able to acquire even more useful knowledge and skills along the way. Every day we have the option to decide if we will be more than we were at the end of the day than we were at the start. Emma removes a bowl of apples on the table and replaces it with a pot of tea and honey for everyone to drink. This tells us that either the table is too small for 5 adults to sit with cups of tea and a bowl full of apples, or that the Bradstone family has recognized a recent shortage of nearby apples and doesn't want their guests to reduce their already limited supply. Little do they know, sitting next to them in Richard's pack is enough apples to feed their entire family for almost 2 months. Emma makes all the women in the audience happy when she tells Richard to take his shirt off so she can focus on cleaning the wounds in his back. With the camera's unrelenting focus on his six-pack ab muscles and his chiseled jaw, we're shown Richard's sensitive side as he almost starts crying from having a stiff brush rooting around the open wounds on his back. We're given a dose of cognitive dissonance without resolution that triggers any latent caretaker tendencies. In January 2017, in an article written by Thomas Xavier for morethanjustsurviving.com titled How to Properly Clean a Cut, Scrape, or Wound to Prevent Infection, the author of that article covers 6 basic steps to take when cleaning a wound, which all closely mirror the behavior which Emma displays during her admittedly long and successful career as the wife of a man who seems to attract other bloodier men. Step 1 is to assess the environment and how it can affect the wound. By taking Richard to a place indoors and having him remove his shirt, she can safely work on the wound during the process of cleaning it. Step 2 is to figure out what kind of cut he has and knowing how deep it is. This step is important and is covered when the author describes her as being familiar with this process. Step 3 is to figure out if there is any debris in the wound. Since Emma determines there is, she moves on to steps 4 and 5, irrigating the wound to clean it out of blood and surface contamination while using warm soapy water. And using a stiff brush to accomplish this is a bit harsher than the methods and techniques used today, but given the lack of modern medicine and traditional antibiotics, it makes sense to trade some patient comfort and a few layers of skin for the added certainty of knowing the wound is clean. Step 6 is to sterilize the wound, irrigating it, and making sure there are no more foreign bodies lodged in it. After drying the wound, she applies a healing salve to it while Chase ends the heart-throbbing, shirtless Richard portion of this chapter. While we are never told what is in the salve that goes on Richard's back, I have a theory that the answer may be hiding in plain sight. Recall that there was a container of honey present to be served alongside the tea. In a study published by Krager Organization titled Topical Application of Honey on Surgical Wounds, they demonstrate that honey dressings can help heal wounds. Another study released in April of 2012 by the Asian Pacific Journal of Tropical Biomedicine titled Honey, Its Medical Property and Antibiotic Activity showed the best known type of honey inhibits approximately 60 kinds of bacteria. It also suggests that honey is an effective treatment for wounds infected by MRSA. Emma asks, would anyone like something to eat? And in spite of almost getting killed 3 times in one evening, Zed says, well, I wouldn't mind. But Richard and Kaylin are having none of that noise and use their body language to bully Zed into going hungry for the evening. The author uses the Clark Kent effect on Chase again to humanize him by having him be powerless to stop his wife's embarrassing public display of affection well, without using a cup of tea as an exercise to pull away. Chase tells Richard that he's worried about him because he's been nearly killed 5 times in the last 4 days. But he's interrupted by one of his children waking up to see what's all this about then, with strange people coming in at an even stranger time of the night. Chase makes faces at his own progeny, a skill which she then demonstrates her own mastery of, before he calls her ugly. He gives her a hug and sends her back to bed. But before she can leave, Zed takes his revenge for not being fed by pulling the old, "Hello there, little one. I have this fluffy and wonderful cat I want to give you, and he will be sad if you don't say yes and agree to love him," right in front of the girl's parents without any regard for their personal policies about pet ownership. And it works. And then Chase's daughter pulls the old, "Let me handle this one, Mom and Dad. He can stay with us and I'll love him and feed him and give him pets." And this works too. While all of this is going on, Richard asks Emma if he can borrow some travel clothing for Kaylin, with the full knowledge that this is likely a suicide mission, and in all reality, the probability of those outfits ever being returned to their rightful owners is practically non-existent. And spoiler alert, we never hear about these clothes being returned ever again in the rest of the novels. Never. Not after the boxes, not after the war, not after the Golden Goddess, never. Not even a messenger with some money for replacement clothes. Even when Richard was nearby in Faith of the Fallen, never. This promise remains forever unfulfilled. Emma doesn't comment on the fact that she will never see her daughter's beloved outfits again, and takes her, Kaylin, to the room so she can see if they can find something that will fit her. Kaylin becomes an accomplice in Zed's feline transfer of ownership and ruthlessly deepens the bond between the little girl and her new unsolicited cat, forever destroying any chance that Emma and Chase may have had if they were secretly planning to get rid of the cat after the Seeker and his travel companions depart, by asking if it would be a bother if the 12-pound cat insists on sleeping in the bed with people. Once all the girls leave the room, Emma knowingly closes the door so Richard and Zed can talk with Chase about some serious business. Richard mentions the conspiracy that his brother was talking about being worse than he knows, which, to be fair to Michael, is probably true. Considering that it took multiple death threats for Michael to give his own brother the loser's salute, it seems unlikely he would be on board if he was fully informed about the whole becoming a slave to the omnipotent whims and wishes of someone else. Chase plays hard to get, giving Richard no choice but to unsheathe his sword, whip it out, and lay it right there on the table in front of him in full view of everyone. Chase leans forward on his elbows and lifts it with his fingertips, rolling it in his palms, inspecting it closely, carefully, running his fingers over it. Chase pretends not to be impressed, even though he really is. Richard tells him that he knows Chase has seen it before, and he can stop pretending like he doesn't know exactly what he has right in front of him. Chase admits that it's true, but until now he could only admire it from a distance, and this was his first opportunity to get a good, hard look at it this closely. Chase adopts a dark and intense expression when he says, "The point is, Richard, what are you doing with it?" Richard cryptically says, with a penetrating gaze, that a wizard gave it to him. Chase doesn't understand and asks Zed what he has to do with all this. Zed can only lean closer, and when he says, "I'm the one who gave it to him," Chase leans back from both of them, shaking his head in disbelief. And while he doesn't mention God at all, he does praise the spirits in front of it, and seems very pleased to have the real deal staring him right in the face on his own dining room table. During this exchange, Chase displays a few character traits that would be consistent with someone who is used to getting information out of someone else. While Zed knows more about how to create and recognize cognitive dissonance in others, he's still quite affected by it quite a lot. Chase is the first character who seems to actively resist being drawn into the dynamic. At every turn, he offers no information, or the bare minimum of information required to keep the conversation moving. He's trying to get information out of people, not give it. Much like Zed did with the angry mob in the last chapter, Chase withholds validation in a different way. Zed's aim was to distract the crowd and misdirect them. The dissonance was to draw their attention so Zed could slip in a bit of added information each time without them noticing. Sort of like cognitive sleight of hand, giving him, fittingly enough, the aura of a cognitive wizard. You were watching his every move at all times, and there was always something going on. But even through all of that, in plain view of everyone, the trick still leaves the audience mystified as to what just happened. Chase is using the exact same mechanic, but doing something completely different with it. Chase withholds information to make people feel uncomfortable. When a person speaks, they expect to have what they were talking about be acknowledged. When that acknowledgement is withheld, it creates a vacuum of validation. pulling the person to offer more information with the hope of producing enough interest to reach the validation they don't realize that they're chasing. Chase withholds comment, and Richard recognizes that he's waiting for someone to say something more consequential. While offering very little information on his own, Chase manages to get the entire story from Richard by describing out loud what is physically in front of him and asking for more information. And it works. Richard spills all the beans and tells Chase to tell him about the boundary. In a moment of heroic stoicism, Chase gets up and walks over to the fireplace, staring soulfully into the flames while he thinks big person, quiet, brooding thoughts. Finally, Chase asks his lifelong close and personal friend if he knows what he does for a living. And Richard gives him the perfectly acceptable response, keeping people away from the boundary for their own good. Chase shakes his head and asks the survival expert and woods guide with decades of experience if he knows how to get rid of wolves. Although in Richard's defense, in the entire Sword of Truth series, he never does anything to destroy a part of nature, which is different from using a part of nature. Richard knows how to kill a wolf, destroy a medicinal plant, or chop down a tree, but he never takes more than he can use or puts the system under more stress than it can handle. Especially at this stage during his career as Seeker of the Truth, it makes perfect sense that Richard had never given destroying part of nature any thought, even hypothetically. Richard says, "You hunt them." And Chase says, "You sweet, naive, beautiful, beautiful man. You would only succeed at destroying part of the world population that way. And that the real secret to an extinction level campaign is through mass starvation, by hunting their food supply." Chase tells us it's easier to hunt the food so that fewer wolves are born. But instead of hunting rabbits, he is hunting the food supply, which is the people who get too close to the boundary, which are feeding the things that are coming out of the boundary. Richard realizes the boundary is dangerous, and feeling things generally makes them stronger. And Chase describes the different kinds of people who try to get too close to the boundary and what their rationale is. His main point is making people afraid of the boundary wardens, keeping enough of them away so the things that live in the boundary don't get stronger. The symbolism here is a bit tricky to figure out at first, but once I put it all together with Chase's symbolic representation of independence, it makes a lot more sense. If you remember from previous chapters, the boundary represents the event horizon of a cognitive singularity. A place within the mind where a person's thoughts can go no further because they have willingly and permanently closed off the part of their mind which is capable of having those thoughts. Chase goes on to say it is his sacred duty to protect people from the things that come out of the darkness. This description is as close as Terry gets to spelling out the meaning behind the boundary wardens. The area within the boundary represents our rational mind, still intact and capable of reasoning so long as it does not leave the area it has set aside for itself. The people going near the boundary represent different thoughts and ideas of the rational mind, but once those ideas step through the boundary into the part of the mind which cannot function, they are gone forever beyond the event horizon of their own cognitive singularity. While there are many manifestations of this, such as Richard's original opinion regarding the morality of anger, or the belief that a man does not have the right to judge the life of another man to be forfeit, regardless of whatever baby-torturing acts this hypothetical person may be committing repeatedly in front of the person who believes this. At the root of almost every lie that creates a boundary, removing us from the part of our mind that goes beyond, is a fallacy of consent. A choice or a moment where someone gives up control of part of their rational mind because they have determined some higher truth dictates what they must do in a given situation, regardless of what the facts are telling them. And beneath almost every fallacy of consent is a decision that a person is not good enough or capable enough or skilled enough or worth enough to make that sort of decision for themselves. It is the worst sin a person can commit to themselves because this person has turned their thoughts so far inwards that the feelings of the self they have forgotten. They aren't any different from the rest of all of us. We all doubt the same. We all fear the same. We all love and hurt the same. We all feel alone. We all have the desire to connect with others, and we feel confused when other people attacks the things that makes us who we are. We all get angry. We all get sad and happy. We all love for those who care about us. We all feel pain for those who would be our enemies, regardless of whether that relationship goes one or both ways. We all fear death. We all wonder what is waiting for us when that happens, and we wonder if there is something else or if we just fade away for good. And that is terrifying, and it should be. And our body tells us it's terrifying every chance it gets. But if we remember from earlier, the subconscious can only tell us what it thinks by feeling. It can't communicate directly or clearly, only through sensation. Here is the lie, the biggest lie, the lie that holds back more people than any other, the lie that everyone does everything they possibly can do to believe, the lie that makes the pain go away a little by blocking out the part of the mind that goes around it, making it impossible to even think about. That sense of dread is not a fear of the unknown. It is the fear of a single greatest known fact that your subconscious mind is capable of knowing. We are responsible for every second of our lives. And this is the point which causes many people to turn around and run from that as fast as they can and as far as they can, mentally castrated and powerless to even consider it to be true. While accepting this responsibility gives a person tremendous power, it also comes with a heavy price. Time is precious and irreplaceable, and every second of it that isn't making a person's life better is by their own choice. When every second of every minute matters, when a person wakes up excited in the morning to learn to do new things and goes to bed angry because they don't have any more time in the day to learn and do new things, that is a life filled with joy and energy, happiness, and purpose. When we ignore that ownership of our lives and the choices we make, even the choices we don't like, especially the choices that don't seem fair, we make living a life of joy so much harder, because instead of living our lives with joy, we are living our lives constantly hurting ourselves, all for the fear of being in charge of our own lives. But the true irony here is, if a person resists the ownership of a choice like that for fear of getting it wrong, it's already too late for the person to have to worry about getting it wrong at all. They will punish themselves every day out of sheer habit until they learn it is their own cognitive dissonance that drives them, or they die, never having owned a single moment of any part of their life that was truly their own. Mankind has free will and can choose to use that free will to act as though they have none, accepting that which they are not to decide. But mankind can commit no other actions of free will so long as this is true. When you decide you have no free will, you behave as though you have no free will. We can do anything we want with our free will, even live our entire lives acting like we don't have it at all. But none of that time ever comes back. It's gone. This is where Chase, as the embodiment of independence, comes into play. The thoughts and ideas which get too close to the boundary, that stray too close to giving up all sovereignty, can be turned back by independence and self-reliance. It is much harder to ignore a sense of agency when that sense of agency is placed next to a physical example which proves its existence. Chopping down a tree proves to a person they can chop down a tree whenever they can. Ordering a pizza, but only the larger sizes, to maintain the proper price per square inch and optimal tasty topping to outer crust ratio, proves to a person they can get pizza whenever they need it. Construction teaches a person they can build a home, and a computer scientist teaches a person they can access the world of information and exchange, and countless other examples. The self-reliance stands as a barrier between the irrational surrender of free will and the rational mind. That's why people weren't allowed to read back in the Dark Ages. They couldn't gain that independence and were much easier to control. Now we give up that free will in other ways. The more a person learns to do for themselves, the more a person will believe they can do for themselves. Chase is a part of ourself that we can build up to make our minds strong against the fear of responsibility. By learning to do more, we're taught to believe we can do more. Chase says the boundary wardens follow orders when they have to keep the peace, but their real higher power is the one true seeker because his goals align with their goals. The symbolism is plain as day now. The only thing our self-reliance cares about is the truth, and that is the only master it will truly serve. Chase pledges his life in defense of the seeker, and Richard spends the next few minutes giving his friend the top 20 countdown of their greatest hits from the last few days. Chase is moved to tears by the retelling of Zed's story about convincing the angry mob they were castrati. Once these three men are done acting like the most important people in the room, the door opens and Kaylin becomes the most important person in the room. We see an upgrade in Kaylin's clothing from a ceremonially significant but highly impractical white dress into a full set of travel gear. A good shirt, a nice belt, a nice backpack, great pants. The author does point out that while most of her outfit is brand new, Caitlin has a much better sense in shoes than Emma does, as she chooses to keep her own boots in favor of any hypothetical boots she may or may not have been offered to her off camera. This sort of suiting up montage is an extension of the earlier metaphor. Without self-reliance, a person is ill-equipped to face the challenges of their own responsibility. Chase hasn't given her a guarantee of anything, only the proper tools she would need to do her job well. After the description of the tools, Richard goes on to say behind those tools is a person who wields them is so much more important. Richard lets Chase know that Caitlin is their guide. Now that Caitlin and Emma have entered the room, Richard finally sheathes his sword, giving the impression that he is fine having it on display in front of his two male, close, personal, lifelong friends. Not that there's anything wrong with that. One of which happens to be his grandfather. And there's nothing wrong with that either, because this entire time it's always been the sword of truth and not his penis. I feel like I shouldn't have to say that, but I think if I don't, someone would get the wrong idea or something. And I wouldn't want to be responsible for that. My own existential fate and worth as a human being, measured against an impossible standard of values? Sure. Leading people to think that there was some shenanigans being entertained about Richard and his grandfather? Not so much. So I'll ask everyone to save those sorts of things for their private fan fiction, which sadly must already exist somewhere. Chase listens to the rest of the story and then says, "This is all great, but what can I do as one man to help?" Richard says, 1, where's the pass? And 2, give me the pass. Richard's advanced interrogation techniques pay off because he shocks Chase into overplaying his hand when he doth protest about a pass too much. This gives Richard all the information he needs, but Chase plays hard to get and Richard gets angry at him. Richard's new ability to show some damn anger once in a while is something that Chase can appreciate because the situation calls for it. And since Richard showed him his sword, he will personally show him what he has to offer. Richard tries to think of the children when he tells Chase it's too dangerous for him to get involved, but Chase isn't having any of that noise and says it's his way or the highway. Symbolically, this tracks. If a person is going to challenge their own mental boundaries, they need to be able to call on considerable independence and self-reliance to be able to survive the experience. Richard realizes he has little choice and knows he can't change his friend's mind by force and accepts Chase's offer to help. Chase tells us the name of the pass is the King's Port in a tough place called South Haven. Chase tells us it's a 4 to 5 day ride along the very same Hawker's Trail that Richard and Caitlin encountered the quad on. Chase tells his friends to get some sleep while he prepares supplies for their journey. Once again, symbolically, this independence gathers anything and everything it can to give the rational mind its best fighting chance. And this moment brings us to the end of Chapter 11. It's time for the official #1 quote from Seeking the Truth About the Sword of Truth in Wizard's First Rule, Chapter 11. Please note that the views and opinions of what the official #1 quote for this chapter is may differ from the views and opinions expressed by you about what your #1 favorite quote for this chapter is. In the event that your #1 quote is different from the one mentioned here, please list your candidate for #1 quote in the comments below. And the official #1 quote is, "She apologized for hurting him, but she said she had to get all of the dirt out or it would be much worse later." In the next chapter, Richard, the old wizard, Chase, and Caitlin set out for the pass through the boundary, and Zed impersonates David Blaine by holding up a bridge. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you feel like you've gotten something of value from this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. If you really like it, I ask you share a link to this video with someone else who enjoys the Sword of Truth series. If those feelings are not there yet, I invite you to come back to the next episode and give me a chance to try and change your mind. Thank you for watching. My name is Tom, and I've been your guide. This has been Seeking the Truth About the Sword of Truth. Come and join me next time so that while I am seeking these truths, you can become seekers of that truth as well. Thank you, and I hope to see you again. Until then, live well.